In circa 465, the Athenian democracy was being actively undermined by Cimon and the pro-Spartan conservative movement. The conservatives, who were primarily the upper classes, believed political power should rest in the hands of the well-born and the educated. To this end, the conservatives used the power of one of the branches of the Athenian government, the Areopagus, to control Athenian politics, essentially constraining the Athenian democracy. However, the conservatives could not hold absolute power over the entire Athenian government, meaning opposing voices like those of Pericles and Ephialtes could emerge in the assembly. Pericles and Ephialtes argued that the conservatives were abusing the powers of the Areopagus for their benefit and that this blatant abuse of power was against the democratic nature of Athens. With their numerous attacks against the conservatives in the Athenian assembly, Pericles and Ephialtes found many new pro-democratic supporters, but even with this newfound support, they still could not break the conservatives' hold over Athens. This dominance of the conservative movement in Athens over the democratic movement was largely thanks to the leader of the conservatives, Cimon, whom most Athenians loved for his military victories and philanthropic spending on public building projects. While this political battle was happening in Athens, one of the cities in the Athenian-controlled Delian League, Thassos, was thinking of leaving it. Now, this certainly wasn't an overnight decision. Thassos was all too aware of what happened to the first and so far only deserter from the league, Naxos, but the injustices Thassos had endured under Athenian hegemony were just too many to bear. To explain, the Thracian mainland just across from Thassos was originally controlled by Thassos before Persia conquered it in the 6th century. Then, when the Delian League liberated this area in 470s, the Athenians didn't give it back to Thassos. Instead, they kept it for themselves. Athens did this because this area was rich in timber, farmland, and precious metals, all valuable resources they wanted to keep under their direct control. Furthermore, the fact that Athens kept parts of Thrace for itself started threatening Thasian trade and taxation. This is because before Athens took control of the area, it was mostly Thassos that fulfilled the area's economic need for shipping. Essentially, many resources were flowing out of Thrace into the Aegean, and Thassos was the primary provider of ships and sailors for this trade, which the city-state could also heavily tax. However, now that Athens controlled the area, more and more shipping was facilitated by Athenians, not Thasians. Therefore, even though Athens had kept parts of Thrace for themselves already in the 470s, the ever-increasing Athenian encroachment on Thasian trade was the final straw that pushed Thassos to leave the Delian League in 465. When the Athenians found out about the rebellion of Thassos, they employed the same tactic as they did with Naxos. They declared that no one could leave the league without their consent and swiftly dispatched Cimon to defeat Thassos and force it back into the league. Cimon quickly defeated the Thasian navy, but the city couldn't be taken easily as it had extensive stone wall fortifications, and so Athens prepared for a long siege. In 5th century Greek warfare, taking well-fortified, walled cities was extremely hard and often took a lot of time. This was because siege equipment like catapults were not invented yet, and other siege equipment like battering rams, siege towers, and scaling ladders were still quite rudimentary. Therefore, the only way to really ensure victory in a siege was to wait until the people in the city surrendered. This meant that sieges of well-defended cities, like Thassos, often lasted years, were very expensive and left the city doing the besieging vulnerable to attack back home. Thassos knew this, so while Athens was besieging them, they appealed to the Spartans for help. When the Thasian envoys arrived in Sparta asking them to join the war and attack Athens, they were received with great interest because the Spartans were recently getting increasingly annoyed with the Athenian politics. Sure, the pro-Spartan conservatives with Cimon at the helm were still largely in charge of Athens, but the newly invigorated democratic movement, championed by Ephialtes and Pericles, was gaining ever more traction and started to increasingly quarrel with Sparta, especially over control in central Greece. Hence, Sparta wanted to use the Thasian appeal for help as an excuse to attack Athens while it was vulnerable and, with the presumed ensuing victory, not only gain control over central Greece but also completely eliminate the democratic movement in Athens in favor of the pro-Spartan conservatives. Due to all these reasons, as Thucydides writes, Sparta, in secret and without Athenians being aware of it, agreed to help Thassos by attacking Athens. Before we get into what just happened in Sparta, I would like to tell you about my merch store. Since last video I have released 3 new shirts, an embroidery of the Slavic Sun and Slavic Moon shirts, and to represent my Athenian Empire series, and also kind of my love for classical Greek history, I released a shirt with an embroidery of the Athenian owl surrounded by a laurel leaf. It looks quite cool, honestly. If you're interested in stuff like this, please go check out my merch store. The shirts are quite nice, and personally I think the embroideries look pretty good. Link in the description and the pinned comment. Back to the video. However, before Sparta even had time to prepare for the upcoming war with Athens, a great earthquake struck the Peloponnese. According to Plutarch, it was the biggest earthquake than any before reported, splitting the land of the Spartans into many chasms. It shook Taygetus so strongly that sundry peaks were torn away and demolished the entire city of Sparta with the exception of 5 houses. Many Spartan citizens died that day, which was a major immediate problem for Sparta due to how the Spartan society was structured. The Spartan society was based on a caste system. At the top you had full Spartan citizens, the Spartiatii. Under them you had people living in the outlying towns and villages within the Spartan state, the Perioiki, and under them you had slaves called helots. Within Sparta, the actual Spartans, the Spartiatii, were heavily outnumbered by the Perioiki and the helots, and therefore, when much of Sparta was destroyed and a sizable number of the Spartan citizens were killed, there was a big fear in Sparta that many of the Perioiki and helots will rebel, which they did, because they wanted to change the caste system. Knowing this, as soon as the earthquake ended, the Spartan king mobilized all the remaining Spartans, who then waited in the city's ruins in full armor prepared for battle. When many of the rebels showed up to Sparta to try to deal the final blow to what they thought was a decimated population, they instead found the Spartans in full military gear, ready for battle. Seeing that the Spartans were ready for them, the rebels, rather than fighting in a pitched battle, quickly retreated to a fortified mountain stronghold called Ithome. Circling back to explain further the Spartan caste system. In Sparta, the Spartans, in other words the Spartiatii, were mostly soldiers, priests and politicians who were responsible for the running and defense of the state. The Perioiki were mostly traders, craftsmen and manufacturers doing commercial and money-making activities that were deemed unworthy to do for a proper Spartan. And the helots were slaves who were mostly forced to work on farms and who were owned by the state. Despite the Perioiki being essential to the Spartan economy and having to serve in the Spartan army, they were still treated as second-class citizens who were not allowed to vote, hold office, or influence the city's politics in any way. However, they were still personally free, unlike the helots, who were just slaves used by both the Spartans and the Perioiki. When the rebellion started after the earthquake, it was mostly just the helots that rebelled, with only 2 tribes of the Perioiki joining them, the Thuriaites and the Aithaians. Rest of the Perioiki, even though second-class citizens, presumably thought it was more beneficial for them to stick with the Spartans rather than try to rebel with the helots. The Spartans quickly put down most of the rebellion but could not dislodge the well-fortified rebels at Ithome. As you remember, siege warfare was very hard in 5th century ancient Greece. While this was happening in Sparta, Athens was still besieging Thassos, who now knew Sparta was incapable of helping them. Therefore, after 2 long years of withstanding the Athenian siege, the Thasians finally surrendered in 463. Following their surrender, the walls of their city were torn down, all their triremes were confiscated, they were forced to pay war reparations and a higher annual payment to the Delian League, and they had to renounce their claims on Thrace. Just as the war with Thassos ended, a curious Spartan envoy arrived in Athens, pale of face and soliciting an army, as Plutarch put it. The envoy explained that the Spartans were having trouble defeating the fortified rebels at Ithome, and so they were now appealing to the original Hellenic League members for help, which included Athens. If you want to know what the original Hellenic League was, go watch my first video in the Athenian Empire series. After the Spartan envoy explained himself, a heated debate erupted in the Athenian assembly. The democratic movement, championed by Ephialtes and Pericles, strongly opposed sending an army to help Sparta because they viewed Sparta as an Athenian rival. After all, Sparta strongly objected to Athens rebuilding its walls, it continued to quarrel with Athens over political control in central Greece, and it promoted oligarchy in Greece, a system which, in the eyes of the democratic movement, ran against the ideas of the Athenian democracy. Conversely, Cimon, as the head of the pro-Spartan conservative movement, argued that Athens should not let its pride get in the way of helping fellow Greeks in time of need. He stated, "Athens should not let fellow Greeks to be crippled, nor their city to be robbed of its people." With this argument, Cimon narrowly convinced the assembly to send an Athenian army, headed by himself, to help Sparta. However, when all the allied armies arrived to Ithome, including the Athenians, the Spartans started to have second thoughts about Athenians helping them. Thucydides tells us that the Spartans started to be afraid that the more egalitarian Athenians might side with the rebels because the Athenians are well known in Greece to have a quote, bold and revolutionary character, meaning they promote and like democracy. The Spartans also didn't trust the Athenians because they were quote, an alien race. By that, the Spartans meant that the Athenians were not Dorians like the Spartans were, but rather Attic. The idea of ethnicity and race was very complicated in classical Greece, but in the most simplest way I can explain it, the Greeks saw themselves as the Hellenic genos, i.e. race, that was subdivided into multiple distinct ethnos, i.e. ethnic groups like the Dorians, Ionians, Aeolonians, which in turn were subdivided into various phylae, i.e. tribes. Now, to complicate matters more, genos, ethnos, and also to a lesser extent phylae were often interchangeable as words, and depending on the context they were used in, could even mean different things than what we would today call ethnicity or race. For example, someone could be a genos of a particular family unit, which doesn't equate well with our modern definition of race. Also, the meaning of these words changed over time during antiquity, so directly translating them into our modern English words of race, ethnicity, and tribe without explaining the chronological context isn't the most appropriate. However, I don't have time for all of that, so if you want to know more, I recommend reading the book Ethnic Identity in Greek Antiquity, but I digress. To summarize, the Spartans were afraid that due to the Athenian democratic character, along with their perceived otherness, they could not be counted on as reliable help to put down the rebels. So, without actually mentioning any of these reasons, and without considering the fact that they were the ones who asked Athens for help in the first place, the Spartans simply dismissed the Athenian army. The dismissal of the Athenian army by the Spartans, without actually giving any reasons as to why, was a huge hit to Athenian pride and honor, and it made many of the Athenians despise the Spartans more than they had ever despised them before. Plutarch writes that the Athenian army came back home in a rage and at once took open measures of hostility against the Spartans and above all against Cimon, because it was Cimon who championed the Spartan cause in Athens. It was Cimon who argued for helping the Spartans with the rebels. Therefore, it will be Cimon and his conservative allies who will be held accountable for this diplomatic disaster. Ephialtes, with the support of Pericles, seized on this golden opportunity and started to convince many new people over to the pro-democratic anti-Spartan cause. Due to the decline and the prestige of Cimon and the conservatives, it did not take long for Ephialtes to convince the majority of Athenians to his side, and now with the people's support, he went to work. Aristotle tells us that Ephialtes, son of Sophonides, having become head of the people and having the reputation of being incorruptible and just in regard to the constitution, attacked the council of the Areopagus. First, he made away with many of the Areopagites by bringing legal proceedings against them about their acts of administration. Then, in the archonship of Conon, he stripped the council of all its added powers, which made it the safeguard of the constitution, and assigned some of them to the 500 and others to the people and to the jury courts. Ephialtes also rallied the people against Cimon himself, whose reputation was so damaged due to the Spartan incident and due to his connection with the now disgraced Areopagus that Ephialtes had no problem convincing the people to ostracize Cimon in circa 461. As a reminder, ostracism wasn't permanent, it lasted for 10 years, and the ostracized person was still allowed to keep all his property and businesses in Athens. He just could not live in Athens or partake in Athenian politics, meaning Cimon had to leave for 10 years, but his life wasn't completely ruined. With Cimon and the conservative Areopagus out of the political picture, the era of what historians call the quote, radical democracy began in Athens. In essence, it was after Ephialtes' reforms that Athenian democracy would reach its zenith in terms of how much political power was being directly held by the demos, the people. In fact, it was during this time in Athenian history that the word demos kratos, i.e. democracy, was coined. Before this time, Athenians varyingly called their system of government isonomia or isegoria or isokratia, meaning equality of law, equal right to speak, and equality of power respectively. But now, around the time of Ephialtes' reforms, Athenians started to call it demokratia, meaning power of the people, or rule of the people. In essence, no longer did the legal male citizens of Athens just have equal rights within the city-state, they now held the power of the city-state. It seems to be, however, that not everyone was happy with Ephialtes because shortly after his reforms, he was assassinated. By whom? We don't know. Odymeneus says it was Pericles who was jealous of Ephialtes' popularity. Aristotle says he was killed by Aristodicus, who was hired by Athenian aristocrats, and Antiphon and Diodorus say the murder was never solved. We will probably never know who killed Ephialtes or who hired an assassin to kill Ephialtes, but my personal guess is that it was Pericles. Hear me out. Forrest, in the book The Emergence of Greek Democracy, talks about how there did not seem to be a huge uproar in the democratic movement over the killing of Ephialtes. Considering the vigor with which the democratic movement ostracized Cimon and stripped the power of the Areopagus, one would think that if the murderer was someone outside of the democratic movement, especially some conservative aristocrat, they would use Ephialtes as a martyr and would surely use his murder as a rallying symbol against the conservatives. But according to the surviving sources, this did not happen. Of course, the absence of evidence is not the evidence of absence, but one wonders whether the reason why Ephialtes' murder, a man who brought the radical democracy to Athens, seems to have been just a footnote in history, is because it was someone within the democratic movement itself who killed him. Perhaps someone who was constantly in his shadow, someone who was less liked by the common people because he was of noble birth, unlike Ephialtes. Someone who came to dominate the democratic movement after him, and someone who, when he became the leader, simply chose not to dwell on Ephialtes' murder much because he was the one who murdered him. Again, this is purely a theory, but my money is on Pericles. Anyways, with the anti-Spartan democratic movement largely in charge of Athens, the Athenian foreign policy had drastically shifted. Right after the Ithome incident, Athens broke off relations with the Spartans and allied with the historical enemies of Sparta, Argos. Sparta and Argos were the two most powerful city-states in the Peloponnese, and so it was only natural that they had been bitter enemies for centuries. There's even a famous battle where 300 of the most powerful Spartan soldiers fought 300 of the most powerful Argive soldiers. I made a short about it if you want to know more. The Spartans must have viewed Athenians forming an alliance with Argos as a clear act of hostility, which presumably is what Athens wanted as they later allied with the kingdom of Thessaly, also a Spartan enemy. However, this was by far not the end of Athenian antagonism of Sparta. After several years had passed and the Spartan siege of Ithome was still proving inconclusive, an oracle arrived from Delphi, telling the Spartans that Zeus demanded they release the suppliant rebels encamped at Ithome. Presumably, the rebels prayed to Zeus for help, who supposedly answered their prayers through the Delphic oracle. The Spartans, ever the superstitious people, complied with Zeus's demands, but they told the rebels they must leave the Peloponnese and never return. To the dismay of the Spartans, Athenians made a deal with the Ithome refugees to resettle them at a place they had recently conquered called Naupactos. Athenians did not only do this to spite the Spartans, which certainly was a big plus, but also because they needed to pacify the newly conquered area and needed a friendly base on the Corinthian Gulf from which they could better exert control in central Greece and the Ionian Sea. After that incident, the final nail in the coffin of the Spartan-Athenian relations came when two city-states, Megara and Corinth, began a war over the control of the land bridge between the Peloponnese and the rest of Greece. Both city-states were part of the Peloponnesian League, which was led by Sparta, but when Sparta showed more favor to Corinth than Megara in the current war, Megara left the Peloponnesian League in circa 460 and allied with Athens instead. Megara was still at war with Corinth when they allied with Athens, which meant that Athens was brought into a war against a member of the Peloponnesian League. Whether Sparta would do something about this new development will remain to be seen in the next video. With all that said, this sudden anti-Spartan change in Athenian foreign policy should not be surprising. Athens always had a sizable number of people who didn't like Sparta. They were just in the past few decades often overshadowed by the pro-Spartan conservative aristocrats. But now that Athens had become more democratic than ever, the will of the ordinary male Athenian had become the driving force of Athenian politics. And the will of the ordinary male Athenian seems to have been very anti-Spartan and also very imperialistic. To explain the latter point, when Athens concluded the alliance with Thessalian Argos in circa 460, it also sent the Delian League fleet to conquer the Persian-controlled island of Cyprus, which was defenseless ever since Cimon defeated the Persian navy at the Battle of Eurymedon. Around the same time, an Egyptian king, Inarus II, began a rebellion against Persia. However, he quickly realized he couldn't win without outside support and appealed to the Athenians for help. Athenians had become the most well-known Persian enemy in the Mediterranean at this point, so they were the natural first people to ask for help if you were fighting Persia. When Inarus's appeal came to Athens, the assembly voted in favor of an Egyptian military expedition and redirected the triremes currently conquering Cyprus to Egypt. Why was Athens interested in Egypt? Well, Athens has always been a grain importer, as its population was larger than could be sustained by the farms of Attica. Therefore, having an independent Egypt would not only weaken Persia, which remember the Delian League was still at war with, but would also secure an ally who could supply Athens with all the grain it could ever ask for. Also, Diodorus tells us that Inarus dispatched ambassadors to the Athenians to effect an alliance, promising them that if they should liberate the Egyptians, he would give them a share in the kingdom and grant them favors many times greater than the good service they had rendered. And the Athenians, having decided that it was to their advantage to humble the Persians as far as they could and to attach the Egyptians closely to themselves against the unpredictable shiftings of fortuna, voted to send 300 triremes to the aid of the Egyptians. Those were the reasons why the Athenians voted to help Inarus. With the conservatives of the Areopagus out of the picture, it was solely the people of Athens that voted for all these measures. It was the people of Athens who did not shy away from conquering Cyprus and sending a military expedition to Egypt. It was the people of Athens that conquered Naupactos and brought Athens to war with a member of the Peloponnesian League. Meaning, the fact that Athens had become more democratic did not mean that it had become less imperialistic. In fact, as it will become evident throughout the series, it was actually during the time of the quote radical democracy in Athens that the Delian League formed into what historians call the Athenian Empire. But I'm getting ahead of myself. It had been just 3 years since the failed Athenian expedition to help Sparta in circa 463, and so much had changed in that time. Athens was now a radical democracy in an active war against a member of the Peloponnesian League and with a sizable military expedition in Egypt. However, all of this raises many questions. Will Sparta get involved in the Corinthian-Megarian conflict like Athens did? Will Athens succeed in helping in Narus' rebellion? And has Athens perhaps stretched itself too thin? Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed another video in the Athenian Empire series. I would like to mention again at my merch store, there are some really good quality products there, so please check them out. Other than that, as always, shout out to my patrons, especially to my deity tier patrons of Rohan and Kim. Without my patrons' support, I wouldn't be able to do these videos, so thank you so much. Other than that, my name is Emlaser, and stick around for history.